I acquired this Stanley H61A Dovetail jig years ago and decided I was going to learn how to use it. I had no idea of what bits would work with it or even how to use it, so the first thing I did is I went online and I bought some bits, and I started with actually a centering cone from Bosch so I could get my templates centered in the base plate and get that all set up for use. And then I went online and I bought a bunch of standard low-cost dovetail bits in all the different sizes that I could find, just so I could make some samples and see what would work with it and what would not. There's very little documentation available for a jig this old, so this was kind of like a experiment for me. The first thing that I did is I started out with all the bits, and I sat down for about a week of trial and error, and I tried each and every bit to see which one would work with it. And I found that a 1/4 7-degree bit works, and that will do the thinner stock. And then a 1/2 inch 14-degree bit also works for several different thicknesses of stock. And then there's also a 17/32 14-degree bit that I was able to get working with it. And then there was a 9/16 14-degree bit that also I was able to get working with it. And then there were a couple of other old bits that I had laying around that I really don't know what they are. And I took all these little samples that I made and I put them on a rack so that I would have a reference for when I went to do the cuts later. One thing I found out is you always want to start by centering the router base on the bit so all the cuts come out even. And it turns out that it's really easy to use. You just have to cut your drawer width to the right size, and then you put it up against some pins on the fixture and clamp everything in place once you get the surfaces lined up really well. And about the only thing you really have to be sure of is there are some pins that screw in, and there's a 012 and a 018 number on there. You have to make sure that they are set in the 012 position for the smaller template, and then over into the 018 position when using the larger template. And that gives you your pin spacing off the edge so everything lines up properly. I don't know how old this jig is, but I think it's probably at least as old as I am, or maybe even older. The jig moves around a little bit if you don't mount it on a board, so I found out that I took a piece of cherry that's a lot bigger than the jig, and I screwed it onto there from the bottom, and I was able to clamp that firmly to the bench. After your parts are lined up, you just drop on the guide there and tighten a couple of screws, and you're ready to start cutting dovetails. One thing that I quickly found out is you always mount the pieces with the inside of the drawer out, and then you do the right front and left front on one side of the jig, and then you switch over to the other side of the jig and do the right rear and the left front. Somebody had previously engraved this on the jig, so it really helped me get going. And the only other thing is, if you're doing the smaller dovetails, you just have to switch over to the smaller template and smaller bits, and very simple changeover. Now, I'm making a drawer for my next project, so I decided to show you how I set it up. I started by taking one of my sample pieces, and I decided which dovetail joint I wanted to use in the drawer sides. And then I just take that and I measure it, and then I take the plastic template and I set that on the router base, and I adjust the router until I get the exact depth of cut that I just measured off the sample piece. Having made those samples is really great. It really helps with the setup of all the different size joints I plan on doing. And next I just line up and I clamp my drawer sides with the inside facing out in the proper corner, depending on whether it's left or right, in front or rear. And then you just tighten everything down, drop the plastic template on top, and you're pretty much ready to start cutting. Now, the drawer sides that I made for my project are all hard maple, so it is kind of tough cutting these bigger dovetails in it, but if you take your time, it goes pretty good. I like to start by taking a fine cut off the outside before I start going deep into the grooves. That kind of helps with the burrs a little bit that you wind up with. And this is just a video of cutting the first corner. You can actually see that I did have a little problem with the lighted router base flickering on and off a couple times, which I later troubleshooted down to having a exposed solder joint that I never insulated, and it was able to bounce up and vibrate up and hit the bottom of the router base and just short the light out momentarily. And with the first corner cut, I just test fit it to make sure everything was set up right. And luckily it came out really nice and it fit fairly tight. About the only issue that there was is there's about a 64th of an inch overhang on the joint that'll have to be sanded off later. So I continued on to cut the next corner of the drawer. Then next it was off to the other end of the jig to start cutting the two opposite corners that were left to be cut. I never really realized before that these dovetail joints were so easy to cut in the drawer. And now that I figured out how to use the jig, I think I'll be using them more and more in any kind of case construction that I do. Now this is just one more run through of how to set it up with the last corner that I have to do. You just line the boards up so everything is flush and level and squared up nice. And then you just tighten all the clamps up. And you set the plastic guide in place, push that down, hold it down against the wood and tighten the two thumb screws, and then you just start cutting. And one thing that I did find out is that the guide bushing fits very tightly in those little finger grooves in the guide, so you really do have to push it pretty hard at times to make it go fully engaged in the depth of the dovetails. But other than that, it's really a pretty simple process, and I usually just go over it 2 or 3 times lightly just to make sure that I got all the profile perfect. So this is just basically a guide of how to use the Stanley H61A Dovetail Jig, and actually which bits will work with it and what the joints look like that you get with each bit. And if you have one of these jigs, I hope it helps you. The drawer that I started here is part of the next project that I'm going to be making a video of, and I really wanted to pull this out separate for people that may have an interest in this jig or may find an old used one like I did. So I tried to keep it separate. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.